The bitter wind cut through Valentine Sawyer's threadbare coat like 1,000 knives as she stumbled through the blinding snow, each labored step taking her farther from the cruel laughter that still echoed in her mind. It was December 1883, and the Wyoming Territory had unleashed one of its most vicious blizzards in years, the kind that turned the landscape into an unforgiving white hell where even the hardiest souls knew better than to venture. But Valentine had no choice in the matter. She had been left here to die. Her breath came in ragged gasps, crystallizing instantly in the frigid air as she fought against the wind that seemed determined to push her back toward the abandoned campsite where her traveling companions had made their terrible decision. The stagecoach company had hired them to escort freight and passengers from Cheyenne to the mining settlements up north, but when the blizzard had forced them to make camp 3 days ago, everything had changed. The supplies had run low. Tempers had flared. And Valentine, at 22 years old and weighing considerably more than the other 2 passengers, had become the scapegoat for every frustration and fear that gripped the stranded party. She had heard the whispers first, the cruel calculations about how much food she must consume, how much weight she added to the wagon, how her very presence was somehow responsible for their predicament. The wagon master, a thin, bitter man named Garrett, had been the worst of them. He had convinced the others that they would all have a better chance of survival if they left her behind. She remembered the moment she realized what was happening, the way they had insisted she gather firewood alone, how when she returned to the camp clearing, the wagon was already moving, disappearing into the white curtain of snow. Valentine had screamed after them until her voice was raw, but the wind had swallowed her cries. She had tried to follow the wagon tracks, but the snow was falling so heavily that within minutes, every trace of their passage had vanished. Now, hours later, she had no idea where she was or which direction might lead to shelter. Her fingers and toes had gone numb long ago, and she could feel a dangerous drowsiness creeping over her despite the adrenaline that had kept her moving. The landscape around her was utterly featureless, just endless white broken occasionally by the dark shapes of boulders or stunted trees bent almost horizontal by the relentless wind. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a seamstress who had died when Valentine was 18. The past 4 years had been a succession of difficulties, working as a laundress, a cook, and finally accepting a position as a domestic servant for a mining family relocating to the Wyoming Territory. She had never imagined it would end like this, frozen and alone in a wilderness she barely understood. Her foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and she fell hard, the impact driving what little air remained from her lungs. For a long moment she lay there, feeling the cold seep through her clothes with terrifying speed. The exhaustion was overwhelming. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the snow cover her like a blanket, to surrender to the inevitable. But something stubborn in her core refused to give up. She had survived too much already to die because cruel people had decided she was not worth saving. Valentine forced herself back to her feet, swaying dangerously as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She had to keep moving. She knew that much, even if she had no idea where she was going. One foot in front of the other. That was all she could manage. One step, then another, even as her body screamed for rest. The wind shifted suddenly, and through the swirling snow she thought she saw something. A darker shape, more substantial than the rocks and trees. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, wondering if she was hallucinating. But no, there was definitely something there. Hope surged through her, giving her a burst of energy she would not have thought possible. She staggered toward the shape, and as she got closer, She realized it was a building of some kind, a rough cabin made of logs with a lean-to stable attached to one side. She had no idea if anyone was home, did not care. Shelter was shelter. She half walked, half crawled the last few yards to the door and pounded on it with what little strength she had left. The sound was pathetically weak against the howling wind. She tried again, then again, each knock becoming feebler. Her vision was starting to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. She slumped against the door, feeling consciousness slipping away despite her desperate attempts to hold on. Yates Nash had been checking on his horses when he heard something over the wind, a sound that did not belong to the storm. He was a tall man of 26, weathered beyond his years by a life spent mostly outdoors, with sun-darkened skin and pale blue eyes that could spot a stray calf from half a mile away. He had been cowboying since he was 14, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, saving every dollar he could, until finally, 2 years ago, he had managed to purchase this small plot of land about 15 miles northwest of a settlement called Rock Springs. It was not much, just 160 acres of rough grazing land with a year-round creek running through it, but it was his. He ran a small herd of cattle and broke horses on the side, living alone except for his animals and the occasional visit from neighboring ranchers. He preferred the solitude after too many years of bunkhouse living and the constant companionship of other cowboys. Out here he could think, could build something that belonged only to him. The sound came again, and this time he was certain. Someone was at his door. He left the horses and fought his way back to the cabin, leaning hard into the wind. When he reached the front, he nearly tripped over the body slumped against the threshold. For a split second, his heart seized with the thought that he had found a corpse, but then he saw the shallow rise and fall of breath. Yates dropped to his knees in the snow, brushing accumulated white powder off. What he could now see was a woman. Her lips were blue, her face pale as death, and ice had formed in her dark hair. He did not waste time with questions. He got his arms under her and lifted, grunting slightly at her weight but adjusting quickly. She was a large woman, there was no denying it, but he had spent years hauling saddles, bales of hay, and newborn calves through mud and snow. He carried her inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. The cabin was small, essentially one room with a stone fireplace at one end, a bed built into one corner, a rough table and chairs, and shelves holding his supplies. The fire was burning low, and Yates quickly laid the woman on his bed before turning to stoke the flames higher. Heat. She needed heat, but not too fast or it would do more harm than good. He had seen frostbite before, had lost the tip of one of his own fingers to it during a particularly brutal winter in Montana. Once the fire was built up, he turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. She was unconscious but alive. Her coat was soaked through, and he knew he had to get the wet clothes off her before she developed hypothermia if she did not already have it. This was a delicate situation, but survival took precedence over propriety. He worked quickly and methodically, removing her coat, her boots, her dress, leaving her in her undergarments which were also damp but less severely so. He grabbed every blanket he owned and piled them over her, then filled his kettle with water and set it to heat. For the next several hours, Yates kept vigil, periodically checking her breathing, trying to warm her extremities gently, and attempting to get small amounts of warm water between her lips when she seemed semi-conscious. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney, but inside the cabin, the temperature gradually rose to something almost comfortable. It was well past midnight when Valentine finally opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the rough wood of a ceiling she did not recognize, illuminated by flickering firelight. Then the memories came flooding back. The abandonment, the desperate struggle through the snow, the cabin door. She turned her head and saw a man sitting in a chair beside the bed, his eyes closed as if he had dozed off while watching her. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The sound she made was barely a croak, but it was enough. The man's eyes opened immediately, and he leaned forward. "Easy now," he said, his voice a deep rumble with a faint Texas drawl. "You are safe. Do not try to talk yet. Let me get you some water." He stood and moved to the table, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup. When he returned, he slid an arm under her shoulders to help her sit up slightly, then held the cup to her lips. Valentine drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. Slowly, the man cautioned. Not too much at once. When she had drunk enough, he lowered her back down and set the cup aside. Valentine looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably not much older than herself, with a lean face marked by sun and wind, light brown hair that fell past his collar, and eyes that held a kindness she had not expected. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "No need for thanks," he replied. "What in God's name were you doing out in that storm? You nearly died." The concern in his voice broke something inside her, and before she could stop herself, tears were streaming down her face. The whole terrible story came pouring out. The stagecoach journey, the stranded party, the way they had turned on her, blaming her for their situation because of her size. And finally, the calculated cruelty of abandoning her in the blizzard. She wept as she spoke, all the fear and humiliation and desperate loneliness of the past few days overwhelming her defenses. Yates listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the emotional outpouring, he stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the snow though there was nothing to see in the darkness. "That is murder," he said flatly. "Plain and simple. They left you to die." "They thought it would give them a better chance," Valentine said weakly, hating that she was making excuses for them. "We were running low on food and I am not small. I eat more than most women. I suppose they calculated that without me, the supplies would last longer." Yates turned back to her and there was anger in his eyes now. "Did you eat more than the men? More than the wagon master?" Valentine blinked, surprised by the question. "I do not know. I suppose not. Probably less, actually. They took larger portions at every meal." Then their calculation was just an excuse to be cruel. People get scared, get mean, start looking for someone to blame for things beyond anyone's control. The storm was not your fault. Running low on supplies was not your fault. They should have rationed better from the start instead of abandoning a woman in a blizzard. He seemed to catch himself, tempering his anger. "I am sorry. You do not need me raging when you are trying to recover. How do you feel? Any pain in your fingers or toes?" Valentine flexed her hands experimentally beneath the blankets. "They hurt," she admitted. "But I can feel them. That is good, is it not?" "That is very good. Means you will likely keep them all. You were lucky. Another hour out there and we would be telling a different story." He returned to the chair and sat down. "My name is Yates Nash. This is my land, my cabin. You are welcome to stay as long as you need to recover. The storm does not look like it will let up any time soon anyway." "I am Valentine Sawyer," she replied, "and I have no way to repay your kindness. I had some money in my bag, but that is long gone with the wagon. Everything I owned was in there. I am not asking for repayment. You needed help and I helped. That is what decent people do." He stood again, moving to the stove. "You should eat something. I have some stew left from dinner." Nothing fancy, just beef and potatoes and carrots, but it will give you strength." As he ladled stew into a bowl, Valentine found herself studying him. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone accustomed to living alone, doing for himself. The cabin was sparse but clean, everything in its place. There were books on one shelf, which surprised her. Many of the men she had encountered in the Wyoming territory could barely write their own names. Yates brought the bowl over and helped her sit up more fully, propping her against the pillows. She took the bowl gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. The stew was simple as he had said, but it was hot and filling and quite possibly the best thing she had ever tasted. "This is wonderful," she said between bites. "You are just hungry," he replied, but there was a hint of pleasure in his voice at the compliment. "I am not much of a cook. Mostly I just throw things in a pot and hope for the best." They fell into silence as she ate, but it was a comfortable silence, not awkward. When she had finished, Yates took the bowl and cleaned it, then returned to his chair. "You should rest more," he said. "Sleep is the best medicine after what you have been through. Where will you sleep?" Valentine asked, suddenly aware that she was occupying the only bed. "I will make do with blankets by the fire. Done it plenty of times before. You need the bed more than I do right now." Valentine wanted to argue, but exhaustion was already pulling her back under. Her eyes drifted closed almost against her will, and within moments, she was asleep. The next morning, Valentine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wind still battering the cabin. The storm had not abated overnight. She sat up slowly, testing her body, and was relieved to find that while she ached in various places, nothing seemed seriously damaged. Her fingers and toes were painful but functional. She had been incredibly lucky. Yates was at the stove, and he turned when he heard her stir. "Good morning." "How do you feel?" "Like I fought with a grizzly bear and lost," she admitted. "But alive. Thank you again for taking me in. If you had not been here, if I had not found your cabin." "But you did find it," Yates interrupted gently. "No point dwelling on what might have been. You are here, you are safe, and that is what matters. Can you stand? You should probably try to move around a bit, get your blood flowing." Valentine pushed back the blankets and carefully swung her legs over the side of the bed. She was still in her undergarments, and she felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. Yates seemed to notice her discomfort and immediately turned his back, busying himself with the coffee pot. "Your dress is hanging by the fire," he said without looking at her. "It should be mostly dry by now. There is a screen in the corner you can use for privacy if you want to change." Valentine was grateful for his thoughtfulness. She retrieved her dress and moved behind the screen, dressing quickly. The fabric was still slightly damp in places, but much better than it had been. When she emerged, Yates turned back around and handed her a cup of coffee. "I do not have much in the way of women's clothing," he said with a slight smile. "That dress will have to do until we can get you to town, but that will not be happening until this storm breaks. Could be days from the look of it." "I do not mind," Valentine said quickly. "I am just grateful to be warm and dry. And please, do not think you need to entertain me or change your routine on my account. I can help with whatever needs doing. I am a hard worker, I promise." Yates studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I do not doubt that. But right now, you need to finish recovering. There will be time enough to worry about chores later. For today, just rest and get your strength back. That is an order." There was a teasing note in his voice that made Valentine smile despite herself. She sipped her coffee and looked around the cabin more carefully in the daylight filtering through the windows. It was small but well built, with tight chinking between the logs to keep out drafts. The furniture was all handmade but sturdy. The books on the shelf included volumes on animal husbandry, a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays and several dime novels. "You like to read," she observed. "When I have time, which is not often during the warm months. Winter is when I catch up. Gets lonely out here sometimes, and books are good company." He paused, then added, "You are welcome to borrow any you like while you are here." "Thank you. I love reading, but I have not had much access to books lately. The family I was going to work for said they had a small library." "I suppose I will never know now. You were heading north to work as a domestic." "Yes, to a mining settlement called South Pass City. The Hargrave family was relocating there from Boston. Mrs. Hargrave had hired me through an agency in Cheyenne." Valentine felt her throat tighten. "They were expecting me to arrive within the week. I suppose they will think I just did not show up, that I took their advance payment and ran off. There is no way to get word to them. Once the storm clears and we can get you to Rock Springs, you can send a telegram explaining what happened. They will understand." Valentine was not so sure about that, but she appreciated his optimism. They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, Yates doing small tasks around the cabin while Valentine rested and read. He made meals at regular intervals, always ensuring she ate well, and checked periodically on her fingers and toes to make sure there was no sign of frostbite turning serious. The storm continued through that day and into the next, the wind howling like a living thing outside the cabin walls. Valentine found herself relaxing in a way she had not in years. There was something deeply peaceful about the forced stillness, the way the blizzard had cut them off from the rest of the world. She watched Yates as he went about his business, noticing the quiet competence with which he handled every task, the gentleness in his hands when he checked her for injuries, the way his face softened when he thought she was not looking. On the third day after her arrival, Valentine woke to silence. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The drifts were piled higher than the cabin windows in places, and the landscape glittered under a weak winter sun. "I will need to dig out and check on the cattle," Yates said as they ate breakfast. "They should be fine. There is a box canyon about a mile from here where they winter, good shelter and a spring that does not freeze. But I should make sure none of them are in trouble. You stay inside where it is warm." "I could help," Valentine offered. "The snow is deep and you are still recovering. I will be fine on my own. I have been doing this for 2 years now." He pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "There is more wood by the fireplace if you need to build up the fire. I will be back by afternoon." Valentine watched through the window as he dug a path to the lean-to stable, then saddled one of his horses and rode off into the white wilderness. The silence of the cabin after he left was profound. She found herself missing his presence more than she would have expected after such a short acquaintance. To occupy herself, she cleaned up from breakfast and tidied the cabin, which was already quite neat. Then she explored the shelves more thoroughly, examining the few personal items Yates kept. There was a daguerreotype of an older couple, probably his parents, and a harmonica wrapped in soft cloth. Several pieces of tack were hung on pegs, along with a rifle and a handgun in a worn holster. It was the home of a man who lived simply, but not without thought. Valentine found herself thinking about her own situation. The position with the Hargrave family was almost certainly lost to her now. Even if she could explain what had happened, she had no way to reach South Pass City on her own, and she doubted Yates would want to make such a long journey in winter just to deliver her there. Which meant she needed to find a new situation, probably in Rock Springs, assuming there was work to be had. The thought filled her with a weary dread. She had been through this so many times before, the search for employment, the interviews where potential employers looked her up and down with barely concealed judgment. the position she was turned away from because someone decided she did not look the part. She was a hard worker, skilled with a needle, a decent cook and reliable, but none of that seemed to matter as much as her appearance. She had been heavy all her life. As a child, it had not mattered much. Her mother had always said she was just sturdy, built strong for the work of living. But as she grew older and her mother died and she was forced to make her own way, Valentine had learned that the world had very specific ideas about how women should look, and she did not fit those expectations. She had endured cruel comments, pitying looks, and outright rejection more times than she could count. The worst part was that she had started to believe the things people said about her. That she was lazy, that she lacked self-control, that there was something wrong with her. She had tried everything to make herself smaller, eating less until she felt faint, wearing herself out with endless work, but her body remained stubbornly unchanged. Eventually, she had reached a kind of resigned acceptance. This was who she was, and she would simply have to work harder than everyone else to prove her worth. But then the people on the stagecoach had left her to die, and that had shattered something inside her. It was one thing to be judged and found wanting. It was another to have people decide you did not deserve to live. Valentine realized she was crying and wiped angrily at her tears. She would not give those people the satisfaction of breaking her spirit, even if they never knew about it. She would survive. She would find work. She would build a life for herself despite everything. The door opened, startling her from her thoughts. Yates stamped the snow from his boots and came inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. "Cattle are fine," he reported, then stopped when he saw her face. "What is wrong? Are you in pain?" "No, I am fine," Valentine said quickly, trying to compose herself. "Just feeling sorry for myself, which is foolish. I have much to be grateful for." Yates removed his coat and hat, then came to sit at the table across from her. "What you went through would break most people. You are allowed to feel whatever you feel about it." His words were so simple, so sincere, that Valentine felt the tears threatening again. "I was just thinking about what comes next. I need to find work, but I do not know where or how. I have no references now, no money, nothing but the clothes on my back. Who will hire me like this?" "Anyone with sense who needs a hard worker," Yates said firmly. "And if they are too fool-headed to see your worth, then they do not deserve your labor. You will figure it out. And you do not need to worry about it today or tomorrow. You can stay here until you have a plan. I cannot impose on you indefinitely. It is not an imposition. Honestly, it is nice having someone to talk to. I chose this life of solitude, but that does not mean it is not lonely sometimes." He stood and moved to the stove. "How about some lunch? I shot a rabbit on the way back. We can have a proper stew." Over the next week, Valentine and Yates fell into an easy routine. The snow remained deep, but the weather stayed clear, allowing him to go about his work during the day while she kept the cabin in order. She insisted on helping despite his protestations, cooking meals and mending his clothes and doing all the domestic tasks that he usually managed himself with far less skill. She discovered that Yates was a man of many layers. He was quiet but not unfriendly, serious about his work, but possessed of a dry wit that caught her by surprise. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 boys. His parents had died of fever when he was 12, and his older brothers had taken over the family spread. But Yates had wanted something of his own, not just a portion of what his father had built, and so he had spent more than a decade working and saving until he could afford this land. "It is not much," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "Most ranchers would laugh at my operation, but it is mine, bought with my own money, built with my own hands. That means something to me." "It means everything," Valentine said. To have something that belongs to you that no one can take away, I understand that. Have you ever had that? Something that was truly yours. Valentine thought about it. No, she admitted finally. I have always been working for someone else, living in their home, depending on their goodwill. Even the small amount of money I saved was always just a buffer against disaster, not enough to actually build anything with. I used to dream about having a shop of my own, maybe a dressmaking business. But that was all it ever was, a dream. Dreams have a way of becoming real if you want them badly enough, Yates said. I know that sounds like empty philosophy, but I lived it. Everyone told me I was crazy to try to start a ranch on my own, that I did not have enough capital, that the land was too rough, that I would fail within a year. But here I am, going on 3 years now, and I am still standing. You are stubborn, Valentine said with a smile. That is certainly true, stubborn and too dumb to know when to quit, but sometimes that is what it takes. He looked at her intently. I think you have that same quality. You survived something that would have killed most people. You did not give up even when you had every reason to. That takes a special kind of strength. Valentine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, with such genuine respect and admiration. She had spent so long being dismissed and underestimated that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. As the days passed, she became increasingly aware of a growing attraction to Yates. It started as simple gratitude and respect, but it was becoming something more. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands, the sound of his voice when he read aloud in the evenings. She found herself looking for excuses to be near him, to help with tasks that would put them in close proximity. But she firmly quashed any hope that he might feel the same way. Men like Yates did not fall for women like her. He was being kind because he was a good man, not because he was interested in her romantically. She had learned that lesson painfully in the past, mistaking kindness for affection and making a fool of herself. She would not do that again. What she did not know was that Yates was struggling with very similar thoughts. He had been attracted to Valentine almost from the first moment he saw her truly conscious and aware. There was a warmth in her dark eyes, a resilience in the set of her jaw, a quick intelligence in the way she spoke that drew him like a magnet. He loved the way she moved around his cabin as if she belonged there, the way she hummed while she worked, the sound of her laughter when he managed to say something funny. But he was terrified of making her uncomfortable. She had been through a terrible ordeal, had been abandoned and left to die. She was vulnerable and alone, depending on his hospitality. The last thing he wanted was to make unwanted advances and have her feel trapped or obligated. So he kept his feelings carefully locked away, treating her with friendly respect and nothing more. 2 weeks after Valentine's arrival, a neighbor stopped by, a rancher named Hugh Morrison who owned the spread to the east. He was a gruff man in his 50s with a gray beard and a perpetually suspicious expression. "Heard you had company," Morrison said without preamble when Yates answered his knock. "Wanted to see for myself." "News travels fast," Yates replied dryly, "even in winter." "Pete Rawlings was out checking his trap lines and saw smoke from your chimney at odd hours, more than you would make on your own. He mentioned it in town, and folks were curious." Morrison peered past Yates into the cabin, where Valentine was standing by the stove. "That the woman who was abandoned by that stagecoach party. How do you know about that? The wagon master made it to Rock Springs a week ago with his story about how they had to make hard choices to survive. He left out the part about abandoning a passenger, but one of the others in the party was feeling guilty apparently, told the real story at the saloon. There has been talk of bringing charges, but the wagon master has already moved on, headed east. Some folks figured the woman had died in the storm. Yates felt anger rise hot in his chest. She nearly did. She made it to my door by pure luck. Another hour and she would have frozen to death. Morrison looked at Valentine with new interest. You are a tough one, I will give you that. Takes grit to survive what you went through. He turned back to Yates. You planning to keep her here? There was an implication in the question that Yates did not like. Miss Sawyer is my guest. She will stay as long as she chooses. Folks in town might think it is improper, a single man and a single woman living together with no chaperone. Then folks in town can mind their own business, Yates said sharply. If they are so concerned about propriety, maybe they should have mounted a rescue party when they heard what happened, instead of gossiping about it. Morrison held up his hands. No offense meant. Just telling you how people talk. You know how it is. After Morrison left, Yates turned to find Valentine looking troubled. I did not think about the talk it might cause, you being here, she said quietly. I do not want to damage your reputation in the community. My reputation can handle it, Yates said firmly. And anyone who thinks poorly of you for surviving can go to hell. Despite his words, the visit had unsettled them both. Valentine knew that Morrison was right about how people would view the situation. An unmarried woman living alone with an unmarried man would be seen as scandalous, regardless of the circumstances. It did not matter that Yates had been nothing but a gentleman, that he had literally saved her life. All that would matter to the gossips was the appearance of impropriety. I should go to Rock Springs, Valentine said that evening. Try to find a position there, a place to live. I have trespassed on your hospitality long enough. You have not trespassed on anything, Yates replied, but there was a heaviness in his voice. But I understand if you feel you need to go. I will take you to town whenever you are ready, and I will help you find a situation, give you a reference if anyone needs one. You barely know me. What kind of reference can you give? I know you are a hard worker, honest, resourceful, and braver than most people I have met. That is a better reference than most can claim. They decided to make the trip to Rock Springs in 2 days, giving Valentine time to prepare herself mentally for whatever came next. Those last 2 days were bittersweet. Both of them were aware that their time together was ending, and neither was happy about it, though neither said so aloud. On the final evening, Yates built up the fire particularly high and brought out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. He poured them each a small glass and raised his in a toast. To survival, he said, and to new beginnings. To kindness, Valentine added, and to the good people who still exist in the world. They drank, and the whiskey burned pleasantly down her throat. As the evening wore on and the bottle slowly emptied, their conversation became more open, more honest. Yates told her about the loneliness of ranching alone, about the days when he questioned his decision to leave his brothers and strike out on his own. Valentine spoke about her mother, about the poverty and struggle of her childhood, about her dreams of having a real home someday. You deserve that, Yates said, his words slightly slurred by the whiskey. A home, a place where you belong, people who appreciate you. You deserve all of that and more. So do you, Valentine replied. This cabin is wonderful, but it is made for a family, not a solitary man. You should have someone to share it with. I thought I wanted solitude. That was the whole point of this place. But having you here these past few weeks has made me realize how much I have been missing. He looked at her directly, his pale blue eyes intense in the firelight. I am going to miss you, Valentine, more than I probably should. Valentine's heart clenched. I will miss you too. You saved my life, Yates. I can never repay that. I do not want repayment, I just want. He trailed off, shaking his head. Never mind. It does not matter what I want. Tell me, Valentine urged, emboldened by the whiskey and the knowledge that she would be leaving soon anyway. What do you want? Yates looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the conflict playing out on his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. I want you to stay. Not as a guest, not out of obligation, but because you want to. Because you have come to care about this place, and about me the way I have come to care about you. But I know that is selfish. You have your own life to live, your own dreams to pursue. I have no right to ask you to give those up. Valentine felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. You care about me, she asked, hardly daring to believe it. How could I not? You are remarkable, Valentine. Your strength, your resilience, your kindness despite everything you have been through. The way you hum when you cook, the way you arrange things just so, the way you light up when you talk about something you are passionate about. I have been trying not to feel this way because I did not want to make you uncomfortable, but yes, I care about you. More than care, if I am being honest. But I am not. Valentine gestured helplessly at herself. I am not the kind of woman men usually want. I am too large, too plain. Men do not fall in love with women like me. Yates stood abruptly and closed the distance between them, dropping to his knees in front of her chair so they were eye to eye. Then those men are fools. You are beautiful, Valentine, not despite your size but just because you are you. When I look at you, I see someone strong enough to survive a blizzard, brave enough to keep fighting when others would have given up, warm enough to fill a lonely cabin with life. I see a woman I could spend the rest of my life getting to know and never be bored. I see someone perfect. You think I am perfect, Valentine whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Perfect for me, Yates clarified. I am not saying you do not have flaws because everyone has flaws. I am saying your flaws and your strengths, your body and your spirit, everything that makes you who you are, that is perfect to me. That is what I want in my life if you want it too. Valentine could not speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she reached out and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw against her palms. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, a tentative, gentle press of lips that quickly deepened into something more passionate as Yates responded, his arms coming around her to pull her close. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I want to stay, Valentine said. I have wanted to stay for days now, but I did not think you would want me to. I thought you were just being kind. I am being kind, Yates said with a smile. But I am also being selfish. I want you here, Valentine. I want to wake up to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life together, something that belongs to both of us. Will you stay? Will you take a chance on me on this place on us? Yes, Valentine said simply. Yes to all of it. They sat there by the fire for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future and making plans. Yates wanted to marry her properly, as soon as they could arrange it with the preacher in Rock Springs. Valentine wanted to help expand the ranch, maybe plant a garden in the spring, turn the cabin into a real home. They talked about children, about the possibility of building a bigger house someday, about growing old together in this place they would build with their own hands. People will talk, Valentine warned. About us, about how quickly this happened, about my size compared to yours. There will be gossip and judgment. Let them talk, Yates said firmly. I have never cared much what other people think, and I am not about to start now. You are mine, and I am yours, and that is all that matters. They made the trip to Rock Springs 3 days later, but not so Valentine could find employment. Instead, they met with the preacher and arranged to be married the following week. Yates also stopped by the sheriff's office and gave a full account of what had happened to Valentine, providing details that might help if charges were ever brought against the wagon master, who had abandoned her. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Davidson, took notes but did not seem optimistic. The man is long gone, and even if we found him, it would be hard to prove intent to kill versus just poor judgment in a crisis. But I will file the report anyway. You never know. News of the impending wedding spread quickly through the small town, and as Valentine had predicted, there was talk. Some of it was sympathetic, people who saw a romantic story of rescue and love. But there were also whispers about how quickly it was happening, speculation that Valentine must have trapped Yates somehow, that he was just being noble and would come to regret his decision. Valentine overheard two women talking outside the general store while she and Yates were purchasing supplies. "A woman that size would eat him out of house and home," one of them said. "He is making a mistake." The other woman laughed. "She probably convinced him she has skills in the bedroom to make up for it. Men can be such fools when it comes to that." Valentine felt her face burn with humiliation and shame. Before she could react, Yates appeared beside her, his expression thunderous. He walked past Valentine and directly up to the two women. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his voice icy. "I could not help but overhear your conversation about my future wife. I want to make sure I understand correctly. Are you suggesting that Valentine is somehow less worthy of love and marriage because of her size?" The women had the grace to look embarrassed. "We were just talking," one of them muttered. "You were gossiping cruelly about a woman you do not know, spreading vicious lies based on nothing but your own shallow prejudices. Let me be very clear. I am marrying Valentine because I love her, because she is the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and because I consider myself lucky beyond measure that she has agreed to be my wife. What she looks like has nothing to do with it, except that I happen to find her beautiful. Now, if you will excuse us, we have preparations to make." He took Valentine's arm and led her away, leaving the two women standing in stunned silence. Valentine was shaking, though whether from anger or embarrassment or gratitude, she could not tell. "You did not have to do that," she said once they were out of earshot. "Yes, I did. I will not stand by and let anyone speak about you that way. Not now, not ever. You are going to be my wife, and that means your battles are my battles." Valentine felt tears sting her eyes for what felt like the 100th time since meeting this man. "I am not used to having anyone defend me." "You better get used to it," Yates said, his voice softening, "because I plan to spend the rest of my life standing beside you." The wedding took place on a cold but clear morning in late January of 1884. The preacher's wife stood as witness along with Hugh Morrison, who had grudgingly agreed to attend after Yates had essentially guilted him into it by pointing out that he was the closest thing to a friend Yates had in the area. Valentine wore a simple dress that the preacher's wife had helped her alter to fit properly, and Yates wore his best shirt with a string tie. There were no flowers, no elaborate decorations, just two people standing before God and witnesses and pledging their lives to each other. When the preacher said Yates could kiss his bride, he did so thoroughly, making Valentine blush and Morrison clear his throat awkwardly. But Valentine did not care. She was married to a man who loved her, who thought she was perfect, who had literally saved her life in more ways than one. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon, the horse pulling a small wagon containing the supplies they had purchased, including fabric for new curtains, seeds for a spring garden, and a few pieces of furniture to make the cabin more comfortable. As they approached the property, Valentine felt a deep sense of coming home. "This is really mine now," she said wonderingly. "This land, this cabin, this life, it belongs to me too." "It always did," Yates replied. "From the moment you decided to stay. Everything I have is yours, Valentine. We are partners in this." Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, as all marriages are, but it was sweetened by the deep affection they shared. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, found ways to work together efficiently, and gradually settled into a comfortable partnership. Valentine proved to be invaluable on the ranch, helping with everything from tending the cattle to repairing fences to the countless small tasks that kept an operation running. When spring came and the snow finally melted, they planted the garden together, working side by side in the warming sun. Valentine had a natural talent for growing things, and soon they had neat rows of vegetables sprouting in the rich soil by the creek. She also started raising chickens, building a coop with Yates' help and carefully tending her small flock. As the months passed, Valentine blossomed in a way she never had before. She had always been a hard worker, but now she was working for herself, for her own home and future. The difference was profound. She sang while she worked, smiled more easily, and slowly began to shed the armor of defensiveness she had worn for so many years. Yates watched the transformation with quiet joy. He had known from the beginning that Valentine was special, but seeing her truly happy, truly settled into herself, was better than he had imagined. He loved coming back to the cabin after a long day of work and finding her there, loved the way she lit up when she saw him, loved the feeling of her in his arms at night. Their physical relationship was tender and passionate, a source of pleasure and connection for both of them. Yates worshipped Valentine's body with a reverence that made her weep the first time, unable to believe that someone could desire her so completely. He traced every curve with his hands and lips, telling her in words and actions how beautiful he found her, until she began to believe it herself. By late summer, Valentine realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a complex mixture of joy and fear. She wanted children, wanted to build a family with Yates, but she could not help worrying. Would her body handle pregnancy well? Would the child be healthy? Would she be a good mother? When she told Yates, he swept her into his arms and spun her around, whooping with delight. "We are having a baby," he said, his eyes shining. "Valentine, this is wonderful, this is everything." "You are not worried?" she asked. "About what?" "You are strong and healthy. We will take good care of you and the baby. What is there to worry about?" His confidence was reassuring, and Valentine allowed herself to share in his excitement. They began making plans for the baby, discussing names and where the cradle should go, and how they would need to expand the cabin before too many more children came along. "How many do you want?" Valentine asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the cabin porch they had built together that summer. "As many as you want to give me," Yates replied. "1 or 10, I will be happy either way. As long as I have you, the rest is just blessing on top of blessing." Valentine went into labor on a cold March evening in 1885, just over a year after their wedding. Yates rode through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Morrison, who had experience with birthing babies, and the older woman took charge of the situation with brisk efficiency. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Yates feared he might lose Valentine, might lose both of them. He paced outside the cabin, praying harder than he ever had in his life, bargaining with God to let them both survive. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard the thin wail of a newborn. He rushed inside to find Valentine exhausted but alive, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Morrison was smiling. "You have a son," she told Yates, "a healthy boy with good lungs, and your wife did beautifully. She is stronger than she looks." Yates went to Valentine's side and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was scrunched up and red-faced from crying, and Yates thought he was the most perfect thing he had ever seen. "He is beautiful," Yates whispered. "You are beautiful. You did so well, Valentine. I am so proud of you." They named the baby James after Yates' father, and he became the center of their world. Valentine took to motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else, learning as she went and loving her son with a fierceness that sometimes surprised even her. Yates was a devoted father, carving toys for James and singing him to sleep, and taking him everywhere once he was old enough to sit securely in the saddle. Watching her husband with their son, Valentine felt her heart might burst from happiness. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that, twin boys they called Andrew and Michael. The cabin had been expanded twice by then, growing from a single room to a proper house with separate bedrooms and a real kitchen. The ranch had grown too, with more cattle and a string of horses that Yates sold to the cavalry post at Fort Bridger. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and happy. Valentine had her garden and her chickens and her children. Yates had his land and his livestock and his family. They had built something real and lasting together, something that belonged to them. On their 10th anniversary, Yates took Valentine to the spot where she had first stumbled to his door during the blizzard. It was a sunny June day, warm and pleasant, utterly different from that terrible night that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" Yates asked. "If the storm had pushed you in a different direction, if you had given up just a few minutes earlier, if I had not heard you at the door. So many things had to go exactly right for us to end up here." "I think about it sometimes," Valentine admitted. "But then I remember what you said the morning after you found me, that there is no point dwelling on what might have been. I found you, you saved me, and we built this life together. That is what matters." "You saved me too," Yates said softly. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you showed me what it was like to share my life with someone. You made this place a home, Valentine. You made me whole." Valentine kissed him, there in the spot where her new life had begun, surrounded by the beauty of the land they had worked so hard to tame. In the distance, she could hear their children playing, their laughter carrying on the breeze. This was what she had always dreamed of, even when she had not dared to name the dream. A home, a family, a place where she belonged, someone who loved her exactly as she was. "You think I am perfect," she said, echoing his words from that first night. "Perfect for me," Yates confirmed, pulling her close. "Then, now, and always." As they walked back to the house together, hand in hand, Valentine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The cruelty of those who had abandoned her in the storm had nearly killed her, but it had also led her to Yates. She had survived, had fought against impossible odds, and had found not just survival but joy on the other side. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new blessings. The ranch prospered modestly, never making them rich but providing a solid living. Their children grew strong and healthy, learning to ride and rope and work the land alongside their parents. James inherited his mother's quiet determination and his father's skill with horses. Rose had Valentine's dark hair and Yates' blue eyes, and a fierce independence that kept her parents on their toes. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together. When Valentine was 38, she gave birth to their youngest child, another daughter they named Grace. By then, James was 16 and already a tremendous help on the ranch, taking on more and more responsibility as Yates' joints began to ache more in the cold weather. Rose was 14 and had developed a talent for cooking that surpassed even her mother's considerable skills. The twins were 12, full of energy and endless questions about everything. Valentine sometimes thought about the woman she had been before the blizzard, before Yates, before this life. That woman had been so beaten down, so convinced of her own unworthiness, so resigned to a life of service and loneliness. She barely recognized herself in that person anymore. The woman she had become was confident, loved, essential to her family and their enterprise. She had built something that could not be taken away. There were still difficult moments, of course. Times when people in town made comments or gave disapproving looks. Times when the work was hard and the weather was harsh and money was tight. Times when she worried about her children, about illness or injury or the countless dangers of frontier life. But through it all, she had Yates beside her, his steady presence an anchor in every storm. On their 25th anniversary, their children conspired to throw them a party. James was married by then to a sweet girl from Rock Springs, and they had 2 children of their own. Rose was engaged to a young rancher from the neighboring county. The twins were courting sisters from town, though neither was ready to settle down yet. Only Grace was still at home, a bright 13-year-old who loved books and learning and talked about maybe becoming a teacher someday. The party was held at the ranch, with friends and neighbors coming from miles around. There was food and music and dancing, and as Valentine looked around at all the people gathered to celebrate their marriage, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Happy?" Yates asked, pulling her close for a dance as someone played a fiddle. "Impossibly so," Valentine replied. "When I think about where I started, where I thought my life was going, and then I look at all of this, all that we have built, it does not seem real sometimes." "It is real," Yates assured her. "Every bit of it. We made this, Valentine, together. And I would not change a single moment of it, even the hard parts. They all led us here." As they swayed together to the music, surrounded by family and friends, Valentine remembered that terrible night in the blizzard. She remembered the cold, the fear, the certainty that she was going to die alone and unmourned. She remembered stumbling to Yates' door, the last desperate act of a woman with nothing left to lose. And she remembered his face when she woke up, the kindness in his eyes, and then later, much later, the love. She remembered him saying she was perfect for him, and meaning it, and she remembered learning to believe him. The blizzard that had nearly killed her had instead given her life, real life, full and rich and meaningful. The cruelty of strangers had led her to the greatest kindness she had ever known. The worst night of her life had become the doorway to the best life she could have imagined. When Valentine was 56 years old, she became a grandmother for the 7th time. James and his wife had 4 children now, Rose had 3, and the twins had each started families of their own. Grace had indeed become a teacher, running a small school in Rock Springs and living in a neat little house on the edge of town. The ranch was run primarily by James now, with Yates stepping back to an advisory role as age and old injuries caught up with him. But despite his slowed pace, Yates was still every inch the man Valentine had fallen in love with. His hair was gray now, his face deeply lined by years of sun and wind, but his eyes still lit up when he saw her, and his love had never wavered. They spent their days in a comfortable routine, helping where they were needed but mostly enjoying the peace they had earned. In the evenings, they would sit on the expanded porch and watch the sun set over land they had worked and loved for decades. Sometimes the grandchildren would be there, playing in the yard as their own children had done years before. Other times it was just the 2 of them, content in each other's company. "You have any regrets?" Valentine asked one evening as they sat together, wrapped in a shared blanket against the cool spring air. Yates thought about it seriously before answering. "I regret not buying that bull from Henderson when I had the chance. Would have improved our herd considerably. And I regret not building a bigger barn when we had the chance, before the lumber got so expensive." Valentine laughed. "Those are your regrets, Practical things. What else is there to regret? I married the woman I love, raised good children who are raising good children of their own, built something lasting on this land. Those are the things that matter. The rest is just details. He squeezed her hand. What about you? Any regrets? Valentine considered the question. There were moments of hardship she might have preferred to avoid, times of worry and fear and grief when they lost friends or dealt with illness or struggled through particularly hard winters. But regrets, things she wished had gone differently, no, she said finally. Not a single one. Even the hard parts made us who we are, made this family what it is. I would not change any of it. Not even being abandoned in a blizzard, Yates asked gently. It was something they rarely talked about anymore, that terrible night, but it was always there, the foundation their life together was built on. Valentine shook her head. Especially not that, because it brought me here to you, to this life. If I had made it to South Pass City, if I had become a domestic servant for that family, I would have lived a completely different life. Probably not a bad life, but not this life. Not this joy. So no, I do not regret it. I survived it, and everything that came after made it worth surviving. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Valentine thought about all the women out there who might be struggling as she once had, who might feel as worthless and unloved as she had felt before Yates showed her differently. She wished she could tell them all that their worth was not determined by how they looked or what others thought of them, that love and happiness were possible even when it seemed impossible. That survival itself was an act of courage that deserved celebration. When Yates was 68 years old, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. Valentine woke beside him as she had for 43 years and knew immediately that he was gone. The grief was immense, overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. But even in her sorrow, she was grateful. Grateful that he had not suffered, grateful for every single day they had been given, grateful that he had lived long enough to see their children grown and their grandchildren thriving. The funeral was large, attended by people from all over the county who had known and respected Yates Nash. They spoke of his integrity, his hard work, his devotion to his family. They told stories of his kindness, his dry humor, his willingness to help a neighbor in need. And they spoke of his love for Valentine, how everyone had always known that she was the center of his world, how he had never been shy about saying so. Valentine lived for 9 more years after Yates died, remaining on the ranch in a small cottage that James built for her near the main house. She spent her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, teaching them to garden and cook and telling them stories of the old days. She spoke often of Yates, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew what kind of man their grandfather had been. On a snowy December evening in 1926, 43 years almost to the day after she had stumbled to Yates' cabin door, Valentine passed away surrounded by her family. She was 75 years old, and she died as she had lived the last decades of her life. Loved, respected, and secure in the knowledge that she mattered. Her children and grandchildren buried her beside Yates on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the wind whispered through the grass and the view stretched for miles. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, James had inscribed a simple line, "Perfect for him, perfect for us." The ranch continued to be worked by Valentine and Yates' descendants for generations, growing and changing with the times, but never losing sight of the foundation that had been laid by 2 people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through the years, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the greatest blessings. The cabin where it all began was eventually preserved, turned into a sort of family museum where old tools and photographs and mementos were kept. Valentine's garden, expanded and maintained by daughters and granddaughters, continued to flourish. And on certain winter evenings when the snow was falling, family members would look out toward where the old cabin stood and remember the blizzard that had brought their family into being. They would think of Valentine, stumbling through the snow, refusing to give up even when death seemed certain. They would think of Yates, hearing her knock in the storm and never hesitating to help. They would think of two people who had both been lonely, both been incomplete, finding in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. And they would remember the most important lesson that Valentine and Yates had taught them, that love was not about perfection, not about meeting some external standard of worthiness. Love was about finding someone who saw you as you truly were and valued you for it. Love was about building something together, day by day, year by year, through hardship and joy. Love was about surviving the blizzard's life threw at you and emerging stronger on the other side. The story of Valentine and Yates Nash became more than just family history. It became a reminder that everyone has worth, that everyone deserves love, that the judgments of cruel people need not define who you are or what you can become. It became a testament to the power of kindness, to the importance of giving people a chance, to the unexpected ways that fate could work. And on cold winter nights, when snow fell over Wyoming and the wind howled around the ranch houses where Valentine and Yates' descendants lived, someone would always tell the story again. They would speak of the obese girl who was left in the blizzard, of the cowboy who found her and said she was perfect to him, and of the beautiful life they built together against all odds. It was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth celebrating. Because in the end, it was a story about the very best of what people could be. Brave in the face of cruelty, kind in the face of need, and loving in the face of judgment. It was a story that proved love could triumph over hardship, that value was inherent rather than assigned, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were found in the most unexpected places. And so the story lived on, generation after generation, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt unworthy, unloved, or abandoned. Valentine and Yates Nash had built more than a ranch, more than a family. They had built a legacy of love that would endure long after their physical presence had faded, a reminder that every person had value, that kindness mattered, and that true love could overcome any obstacle. Their story proved that perfect did not mean flawless. Perfect meant finding someone whose flaws fit your flaws, whose strengths complemented your strengths, whose very existence made your life better and richer and more meaningful. Valentine and Yates had been perfect for each other, and in being perfect for each other, they had created something perfect in its own right. A love that lasted a lifetime and beyond, a family that honored their memory, and a story that would never be forgotten.